many of us think of fast fashion as something that maybe started in the 1990s with the rise of Zara, H&M, but your timeline of fast fashion starts far earlier. So, when do you define the real start of fast fashion?
Well, first off, I want to just stress that the concept of fast fashion is always super relative. And
Yeah.
so it's very hard to pinpoint, right?
Mm.
And I have published articles and various like encyclopedia entries in the past where I did pinpoint the start of fast fashion to these sort of brands that have changed the game in the mid 20th century, like H&M and Zara, like you mentioned. But the more I dig through history and I'm looking at these archival sources from the 1800s, you realize that it's not a very modern concept at all. I mean, if you read something that was written by Karl Marx, for example, in like the 1840s, it sounds like he's literally describing the fashion industry today because he's writing about the exploitation of the speeding up of the textile production industry. So it's funny because these people are concerned, and all of the different issues they're talking about are pretty much word for word what we're saying today. So that's why I kind of wanted to, yeah, just try to dig a little deeper, figure out what were all these factors that kind of allowed it to flourish. What even led to the start of, Zara. And so I realized that changes in fashion production and ready to wear fashion specifically have been very, very incremental. I'm speaking mostly from the perspective of the United States because that's where my scholarship is focused on. Anyways, mass production of clothing in the United States started in the early 1800s, sorry, the early 1800s, pre Civil War, but it was mostly for sailors and enslaved people, and it was super basic and poor quality, but it was just to kind of clothe these poor people that needed to have quickly made clothing. And then it becomes sort of part of just everyday fashion for men in by the 1870s. But the shift from going from homemade clothing to ready-made or fast fashion, whatever you want to call it, for women's fashion didn't really occur until the early 1900s.
Mm.
But it does become the norm for both like middle income and working or wage earning women in the 1920s. So by that point, it's actually really crazy because you look at all these articles from the New York Times from the 1910s, for example, and they're talking about how you can get 6 shirts for the price of one, and that
Mm.
there's hundreds and hundreds of styles being offered at these department stores, and they're all dirt cheap. And why not have more? And they're already talking about things like the quality being very poor. They're talking about the workers being, treated horribly, but it just doesn't really end there.
Mhm.
So I guess if I had to give an exact time period, I would say that the 1870s to 1920s is sort of when I think fast fashion or this concept really began. Because that's just a period when I think the relationship between people and time and space becomes really disjointed or really weird. Because you've got inventions like the railway, travel, telephone, radio, all of these things that made the world seem a lot smaller and made life seem a lot more convenient and a lot faster.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Back in the early 20th century, already talking about like, yeah, 6 shirts for the price of one and really cheap garments and promoting that as a good thing. And I also really appreciated what you said about the idea of fast fashion being relative. So,
Mm-hmm.
that was fast for 1910. Maybe it would be considered slow now. And it kind of reminds me of what we're seeing now with ultra fast fashion. Like Shein launches new styles every day. And it makes
Mm-hmm.
Zara, who does, releases every week or every other week, it makes Zara look like slow fashion, and it's all
Exactly.
relative.
So
So,
relative. Yeah. And then when you're telling people to buy less and buy better, I mean, that's so relative because some people are buying 1,000 things from Shein a year. And so buying less and buying better is buying 100 things from Zara, whereas that still seems like a lot to other people. So I think, yeah, having to keep that in perspective is always really helpful.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll hear things like, "Well, I don't shop from, like, the worst fast fashion brands like, Boohoo or Shein. I shop Zara." It's like, this relativity is just you see it everywhere, and so that's definitely interesting to consider. And yeah, I think it's always important to like add context and definitions when throwing around terms like slow fashion, sustainable fashion, even fast fashion, and just sort of clarifying maybe what you mean when you're saying that because it can be interpreted so many different ways is what I've found.
Yeah, definitely. I get asked all the time when I meet people who aren't familiar with fashion, what is fast fashion? And it's weird because I assume that most people are like you and I, where we have this
Yeah.
interest. And it's like, well, of course, you know. But I still meet people, and I even have students here who don't see things like Walmart or Target or where places where clothing is sold really cheap as fast fashion. It's much more associated with um, the Shein like kind of trends. But so I think that fast fashion can be applied to either like these trend cycles or affordable clothing, but it's kind of two different things.
Mhm.
So where I am with my thinking right now is that the term fast fashion really just exists to kind of give a name to this complex set of issues that have existed in the fashion industry for hundreds of years. So it's really just the scale that changes. But I think it's just sort of this umbrella term to talk about this discomfort.
Mm.
And I think my own personal definition of fast fashion is really clothing and dress practices that don't follow these logical timescales at all, where
Mhm.
speed and distance essentially become kind of meaningless in a lot of ways. But there is actually one important thing I wanted to mention.
Yeah.
Something that I've been looking at a lot recently is we tend to think about fast fashion today as this really negative, wasteful thing that consumers are just kind of blindly buying more and more. But I'm finding with my research that if you look at the rise of quickly made, cheap fashion, mass-produced fashion in America, looking at the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of the motivations behind having these sort of affordable clothes were about looking clean and put together. Because homemade clothes actually didn't always look so good. You could look kind of, raggedy. So I think most history books do talk about the history of fast fashion or ready-made clothing in the context of people wanting to be like more stylish and to keep up with trends. But there are also these motivations just to look respectable, even if you're living in a poor tenement building. So yes, fashion trends still played into this, but I think many people throughout history have decided to buy cheaply made fashion because they needed to look decent just to get jobs and to kind of assimilate into American culture because there's just been this, pressure for so long to look clean and efficient and all of these things. So I think like really cheaply made clothing that was mass produced, starting in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was promising people happier and healthier lives. So it isn't just this thing that just happened because women are clueless and we just can't help ourselves. We want to buy a new dress every day. It also is something that's been forced upon us in a way through society to sort of get jobs and to contribute in the economy in these different ways.
Yeah, totally. Fashion's so intertwined with identity and culture and society and societal norms. And yeah, for sure,
Oh yeah.
that's important to acknowledge. And do you know with your research, like around how many garments a person might have owned pre mass produced fashion versus, I mean, now I guess it's hard to come by numbers, but I'm assuming we all own like, I don't know, in the US, maybe over 100.
Yeah, you do hear those numbers a lot, but yeah, it's funny. I've actually looked at a lot of different sources trying to find exact numbers, and of course, it completely depended on your socioeconomic class.
Yeah.
Um, but I think the sort of general consensus that historians have come to is that people typically owned maybe just like two outfits. Really, they had like maybe a
Wow.
few, like one coat, one or two pairs of shoes, and this is kind of, I guess, like middle. I guess you could say middle classes of, let's say, Americans in the early 1800s. Um, but yeah, it totally depends. But what I found really interesting is In the early 1900s, there were a lot of different organizations like the Agricultural Bureau of America and these home economists who would literally go like door to door and ask people how much clothes they have, how much did they pay for it, how much did that factor into a household's overall purchases. And so there's actually some very specific numbers that we can turn to. And granted, it's after mass produced fashion, but like the 20s and the 30s, because people
Yeah.
were really trying to figure out like what is the standard of living in the United States. So you look at these and they do seem pretty low. It is
Mhm.
kind of like three shirts, three dresses, two hats, or whatever. And then by the time you get to the 60s, all of these different surveys, which were super commonplace, they stopped doing them. And I feel like that's pretty telling of like, you can no
Yeah.
longer count, nor is it really relevant to count it. So, yeah, I think that I don't want to speak too generalized as these numbers, but it in a lot of ways was quite a positive thing to be able to own more because you did get to save time of washing and laundering and you got to go to more spaces. So it did open up a lot for people, obviously at the detriment of the laborers and of course the environment. So it's a complicated, yeah, complicated story for sure.
Mhm.